Chapter 3. Expelling the last of his air, Amos fought his way to the surface of the river. For an instant he glimpsed the boat's fiery glow. Then the night closed around him, as black as the watery world below him. He felt the current carrying him downstream, and he was tempted to ride the buoyant flow, but he knew he must get to land. He struggled across the current, swimming hard. Just then, something struck his shoulder, and he went under. A heavy, rolling log bumped and buffeted him until he finally grabbed a hold of it. He clung to the log, coughing up water, gasping for air. When he could breathe again, he let go and struck out for the invisible shoreline. He had to reach land soon, or he'd be miles downstream from Clara and Jonathan. Then he might never find them. When his reaching fingers brushed against wet, slippery leaves, he let his legs sink downward until his bare feet touched something solid. There it was, the muddy bank of the river. Floundering through the shallow water, he collapsed face down in the tall reeds. Several minutes passed before his heart stopped pounding and he gathered the strength to sit up. As he gazed toward the sound of the whispering river, he glimpsed movement, a pale reflection. Day was coming at last. Minute by minute, more of the sweeping river became visible. The brightening sky revealed mists drifting over the water like ragged, wind-stirred curtains. As it grew light, Amos's gaze followed the riverbank northward, searching and hopeful. Then his breath eased out in a long, shuddering sigh. A quarter mile or so upstream, he glimpsed Clara among the waving reeds, her knees pulled up to her chin and her head and arms resting on them. He couldn't see Jonathan or Queen Anne yet, but they must be nearby. Amos sprang to his feet and hurried toward her. When he came near and saw her face, he stopped. "What is it?" he asked. "Oh, Amos, Jonathan's gone, and Queen Anne, I was right next to him," she said. "And he was holding on to Queen Anne's tail, but I got too close to her hooves and went under. When I came up, they were both gone." "Jonathan's a good swimmer," said Amos. "He's around here somewhere. We can holler for him." "No," Clara said. "I've been thinking about what you said just before we jumped in the water, about this being the North Shore. We'd better stay quiet. We don't want Indians to hear us." She picked up her knapsack and rose to her feet. "Come on," she said. "We've got to find Jonathan." They clambered up the weedy bank to a flat shelf overlooking the river. It gave them a good view of the riverbank in both directions, but there was no sign of Jonathan or the cow. "They have to be farther downstream," Clara said. She pointed to where the river wound westward out of sight. The current may have carried them around the bend. Not waiting for Amos, she headed in that direction. Amos hurried after her, remembering the urgent pull of the river and his own desperate struggle to reach land. How could a small boy resist the river's power? He can't have drowned, he told himself. After losing their father, they couldn't lose Jonathan, too. Amos stopped when he saw Clara kneel beside a small stream and drink from her cupped hands. He joined her, grateful for the cool water that soothed away the dryness in his throat. As Clara splashed water on her face, Amos stood and looked around. He squinted, welcoming the sun's warmth, while his keen eyes scanned the riverbank for some sign of Jonathan. He couldn't see far because of the trees, but there was something up ahead, a slight movement among the bushes. For several moments he studied the spot. Then he drew a deep breath and released it. What he saw was the repeated flick of Queen Anne's ears. He pulled Clara to her feet and pointed. Then they both took off running. Drawing near, they found the Jersey cow lying beneath a giant sycamore tree, her eyes closed, head drooping. Jonathan lay curled up asleep against her flank, his head resting on his beaver hat. Their rustling steps roused Queen Anne, and her soft brown eyes settled on them only a moment before closing again. "Let them sleep," Clara whispered. Amos nodded, and they turned and walked to the sunlit rim of the river. Clara sat down on a fallen tree while Amos stood staring out at the Ohio. Green hills cradled the broad river, with sunlight splintering the water into tiny, sparkling shards. Amos recalled the storekeeper at Pittsburgh telling him about the river running past his doorstep. He said the English called it Ohio, a form of the Indian word Ohio, meaning great river. He added that the French called it La Belle Rivière, the beautiful river. Whatever its name, the river wrapped Amos in its soft, soothing grandeur. "What are we going to do, Amos?" The tone of Clara's voice shattered the sunny peace. Amos centered his thoughts on her urgent question. Now that they were safe on shore and all together again, they faced other problems. They had survived the Indian raid and the burning raft and the river, but they were on Ohio's perilous north bank. The Indians claimed this land and stubbornly defended it. They were lost and alone, and they had nothing except what was in Clara's knapsack. There had been plenty of things in the boat they could have used: an axe, shoes, food. No crying over spilled milk, Amos thought. Then he felt a surge of hope as he remembered Queen Anne. Her milk would keep them from starving until they found their father. "You think we should head back to Wheeling?" he asked. "You mean go back to where the Indians are?" Clara countered. "Shouldn't we try to find Papa?" "How would we get over to the island anyway?" Clara demanded. "But what else can we do?" Amos flung his arms wide, impatient with all the questions and no answers. "We can go on to Marietta," Clara said at last. "Papa is sure to come looking for us downriver when he sees the boat is gone." "How can we find Marietta?" Amos questioned. "There's nothing but woods for hundreds of miles." "Papa said it was on the north bank. All we need to do is follow the river until we come to it." "But Clara, there are Indians here and all kinds of wild animals. Bears." "Sassafras. I'm not afraid of a bear, and if we see one, we'll just make a lot of noise and scare him off." "What about Indians?" Amos asked in a low voice. "We'll just stay out of their way," Clara replied without looking at him. "How?" Amos wondered. He had heard the men talking last night at supper. They had agreed that Indians could read a trail over bare rock as easily as other people read deer tracks in a plowed field. It would be no problem at all for them to follow the path made by 3 children and a cow. "Besides," Clara went on, "we're not far from Marietta. Papa said we'd be there in a couple of days." "But that was on the water," Amos reminded her. "It'll take a lot longer walking on the land." Clara leveled an angry gaze on Amos. "It can't be more than 3 or 4 days, 5 at the most." Amos pushed his hands in his pockets and kept silent. Clara seemed to think that walking to Marietta was not much more than a stroll across a pasture field. He hoped it would be that easy, but he had his doubts. "I'm hungry, sister." Amos and Clara both turned to see Jonathan coming toward them, scratching his head. His beaver hat hung down his back on rawhide strings. "Jonathan!" Clara burst out. "Queen Anne saved you. I knew she would. She's strong and brave, and she saved me first, then I saved her," Jonathan interrupted. "She had trouble getting up the bank, so I pushed her up." "I'm hungry," he repeated. "So am I," Clara said, and reached for her soggy knapsack. She began pulling things into her lap: a blue calico shawl, small bottles of herbs and seeds, a tin cup and spoon, and a wooden comb. She cast a quick glance at Amos as she lifted out the long-barreled pistol. "Where's the food?" Jonathan asked. "Well, I have some jerky in here somewhere," Clara said. "Here it is." She drew out a thin brown packet and unwound the wet cloth, then held it out to Jonathan and Amos. For several minutes, the 3 of them chewed on the tough, stringy meat. It looked more like dirty leather than real food, but it was salty and satisfying. Rolling up what was left, Clara laid it aside and brought out a shiny crimson apple. She took a bite, then handed it to Jonathan, who bit off a chunk and passed it on to Amos. Taking turns, they reduced the apple to a thin core and a few brown seeds. Clara picked out the seeds and dropped them into one of her herb jars, and then nibbled the core away to nothing. "Can I have another piece of jerky?" Jonathan asked. "No, not now," Clara said, tucking her few possessions back into her knapsack. "We're going to need it later on." "Are we lost, sister?" "Jonathan, just because we're in the woods doesn't mean we're lost," Clara said. "You were never lost in the woods back home." "No, but that was home," Jonathan murmured. "I wish Papa was here." A shiver rippled over his slim frame like wind across the water. Amos laid a hand on his brother's shoulder, feeling the same yearning and the same raw fear. He could never have imagined that they would be separated from their father and marooned in this wild country. Even worse, they were in Indian territory with only a few meager strips of jerky to keep them from starving. He looked at Clara, hoping she would know what to do. She rose to her feet, pulling at her wet, clinging clothes. "We need to get dried out," she said. She untied her apron and hung it over a bush. Loosening the strings of her boat ice, she opened it up wide to let the sun and wind get to her chemise, an underblouse made of soft cotton. Then she began wringing the excess water from her ankle-length skirt. As Amos and Jonathan peeled off their shirts and spread them in the sun, Queen Anne came toward them. She started grazing on the lush grass and didn't even raise her head when Clara knelt and began squeezing milk into the tin cup. Once it was full, Clara handed the brimming cup to Jonathan. He drank it down in one long gulp. The cup had to be filled several more times before they were all satisfied. Then, knowing there'd be plenty more by evening, Clara squirted the milk onto the ground until Queen Anne's udder hung limp and empty. While they waited for their clothes to dry, the three of them talked about the night attack on Wheeling and about their father. "Papa's all right, isn't he, sister?" Jonathan said. "You know Papa," Clara replied in a confident voice. "He can look after himself. He always has his rifle with him." "I'll bet Papa was more worried about us than he was about himself," Amos said. Clara nodded. "He's probably looking for us already." "Then why don't we just wait here?" Jonathan said. "If he comes in a boat, we can give a holler." Amos and Clara exchanged a quick glance before Clara answered. "Jonathan, we're in Indian country and we've got to stay quiet. Our best chance is to go on to Marietta." "You mean walk all the way to Marietta?" Jonathan asked. "It's not far," Clara said. "We walked all the way from Lancaster, Pennsylvania to the Ohio River, didn't we?" "Yes, but we had Papa then," Jonathan declared. The three of them sat in silence, each with his own thoughts about the father they had left behind. One thing they knew for certain. If he was alive, he would come for them. That knowledge, along with the warming sun and the murmuring river, combined to lull their senses and make them drowsy. Even after Jonathan and Clara had drifted off to sleep, Amos remained awake, trying to figure a way out of their predicament. They were alone in the wilderness with no food and no way of knowing how far they'd have to travel to reach Marietta. Besides that, there were wild animals and Indians. Amos had always loved the woods, felt at ease in their cool, dappled shade. In Pennsylvania, where the open woodland served as pasture for the livestock, a short walk always brought him out of the trees and into the plowed fields. But the Ohio forests were unbroken by fields or homesteads, unmarked even by trails. Here in the dark, dense edge of the woods was a wall that hemmed them in, crowded them against the river. A few steps away from the Ohio, Amos thought, and they could be hopelessly lost. If he was alone, it wouldn't matter if he got lost. Wouldn't even matter if the Indians found him. In fact, if he went to live with the Indians, he might be able to forget about Simon. But it was different for Clara and Jonathan. They had no haunting memories to escape. Amos hoped that if the Indians should capture them, he would have the courage to make the same kind of bargain Blue Jacket had made. But the thought of being separated from Clara and Jonathan, of never seeing his father again, made him shudder. They just have to get to Marietta before the Indians found them.